Thank you, Pastor Dan and Pastor Julian, for the congregation for inviting me to be with you here for your Mission Sunday. It's a pleasure, honor, and a joy for me to be with you and to share some of the work that we do on your behalf. We do as a church together. While Lutheran Disaster Response works here in the United States and around the world, as Pastor said, I'm the Program Director of Lutheran Disaster Response in the United States. As you might imagine, I do travel a great deal around the country here, and what worries me most about traveling is not being in an airport or the plane, even though I do go through that nightmare called O'Hare, and I'm often have planes that are delayed and flights that are delayed, and it's frustrating, but that's not what really worries me. What really worries me is when I'm driving in the car, a rental car, or like yesterday when I drove up from Chicago. What worries me is not being tired and falling asleep, or getting a flat tire, or having engine or transmission trouble. What worries me is that when I'm in the blind spot of people, or when others are in my blind spot. Now, you know what I mean by that, right? That part of the car? On nearly every trip I take, including yesterday, I have to make sure that a car is not traveling in my blind spot. On more than one occasion, I've been ready to pass a car in front of me, but I've had to quickly swerve back to avoid getting into an accident. Don't tell my wife. And so I quickly swerve back, and I have to remember then to look in the blind spot so I can see what's going on around me. Today I bring you greetings on behalf of Presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton and the members of the church-wide staff, as well as the nearly 4 million members of the ELCA and the nearly 9,300 congregations. While I'm traveling, I make it a point to take time to listen to those who've been impacted by a disaster. I like to do this because what I hear over and over again from people in an area impacted by disaster is the fear that they and their situation will be forgotten. Yes, once the media moves on, the victims of disaster often fall into the blind spot of our society. You see, it takes a lot longer to recover from a disaster, for a family to recover, a community to recover, to heal from a disaster, no matter what kind it may be, natural or personal. For example, you may be surprised to know that we are still working in New York and New Jersey following Hurricane Sandy more than 4 years ago, and we're planning on working until just about the 5th anniversary, which is the end of October. But I'm here to tell you today that all those impacted by disaster, no matter where they are in this world, will never be forgotten by Lutheran Disaster Response. This morning I'm here to tell you some information about the children who are fleeing to this country, fleeing for their lives from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Because this has been declared a humanitarian crisis, we at Lutheran Disaster Response and the ELCA consider this to be a disaster, consider these children to be refugees seeking asylum. Now you may wonder, why are the children coming? The reason is very simple and very clear: violence and the threat of death. A recent report by Amnesty International said El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras have become virtual war zones where lives seem to be expendable and millions live in constant terror at what gang members or public security forces can do to them or their loved ones. These millions are now the victims of one of the world's least visible refugee crises. Now, when we talk about gang violence, we're not talking about the sort of gangs that we see at West Side Story or other kind of movies like that. We're really more talking about gangs like in 1930s Chicago, ruthlessly and brutally controlling the population in their territory. To put this all in a bit of perspective of the violence, the number of murders in El Salvador this year equals the number of murders that have taken place in the 100 largest cities in the United States. Think of that, one country of about 9 to 10 million, as many murders as 100 of our largest cities. Sadly, children are the main targets. The gangs target them because they know that they cannot fight back. They can't defend themselves. And they know that hurting them is the best way to intimidate the community, for there are few things worse than killing an innocent child. So the gangs are so strong that they try to recruit children to join. If they don't, they're beaten or killed. Or if the gangs are so strong that if a person from one part of the city drives or goes into another gang's territory, they're in danger of being killed because they are part of being accused of being a part of a rival gang. Now, often that line between gangs change weekly, sometimes from one street or one block to the next. Because of this, there are dozens of stories of children who've crossed into a different gang's territory simply to go to school. Since they're not known by that gang, they're told, threatened, to keep out of their territory. So if they want to go to school, they're threatened, beaten, or murdered in cold blood. Now, there are also murders done in connection with extortion. Often what happens is a gang member goes to a business asking for protection money, commonly called the gang tax, of say $20 a week. If the business owner doesn't pay, the person or the children is threatened. If the person does pay the extortion, the next week or so they come back, the gang member comes back and asks for more money. And the next week, even more and more. Eventually, the business person can't pay what is being asked, and that's when the threats begin. If they don't pay, instead of killing the business owner, the gang member threatens to kill one of their children or one of their relatives or employees' children. Since the business owner and the other families know of other children who've been killed for not paying the extortion, the parents send their children to the United States to seek refuge, to seek asylum. And if they don't, eventually their child is killed. You may wonder then, after all this, where are the police? Sadly, they're often controlled by the gangs, bought off with bribes to look the other way. An illustration of how brutal the gangs are was told to me when I was in Central America a couple of years ago. A girl was on a bus trying to flee this country. And the bus was a gang-controlled bus, which she didn't realize. And it went to a check stop, was stopped by a gang member. And so as it went, the gang member went from seat to seat to seat, asking what is the password to be able to go through that territory. This young woman didn't know what the password was, but thankfully she overheard what it was. And so when it came to her turn, she was able to share with the gang member what it was. But a few rows back in the bus, a young woman said, "I'm sorry, I don't know what the password is." The gang member took out a gun, shot her dead on the spot. Is it any wonder while the children feel like they need to flee to seek refuge in the United States? Is it any wonder that the parents have to make that hard choice of sending their children away to this country? 2 years ago, the media reported on the surge of children coming into this country. Some children, some are as young as 3, have been coming to the United States for many years due to the violence. In fact, the number of children coming to this country this year approached that of 2014, but there's been little media coverage, hasn't there? Have you ever heard of that happening again? Thus, these children and their plight in their home country, as well as traveling through Mexico, and once they're here in the United States, are indeed in the blind spot of our country, which is why we at the ELCA, we at Lutheran Disaster Response, are looking out for them. When they're not in our blind spot and never will be. Because few are acting or speaking on their behalf, we feel God is calling us to help these children, which is why the Ammparo strategy was so overwhelmingly passed by the recent churchwide assembly last August. So like me, though, you may wonder, how could the parents send their children on such a dangerous journey to the U.S., especially being so young? The answer I heard from the people in Central America was very deeply humbling. The parents said it was because of their deep and abiding faith and trust in God. You see, they see their situation in light of today's gospel lesson. They see themselves as being persecuted because of their Christian values. And if you think about it, what they are going through, their trials and tribulations, are exactly what Jesus said what would happen when we live out our Christian values. And despite the great fear, despite the great uncertainty in the future of their country, the future of their children, these parents, these children, firmly believe that God will take care of them. God will watch them on their journey and protect them. Now, to help you understand a little bit more about the Ammparo strategy, I'd like to share with you an analogy that you may have heard before. So instead of a beautiful November Sunday morning, let's assume that it's a bright, sunny summer afternoon, and we decided to go walking along a river. And as we're walking along the river, we watch the river, the current going down. We see something in the river, it looks like a log. Don't think much of it, but then we get another look at it, and we realize, no, it's not a log, it's a child. A small child is floating down the river. Well, what would we do? If we have cell phones, of course, we'd call 911, or if not, we'd go get help. And pretty soon, policemen and firemen, ambulance, and other people would come, and they'd pull that child out of the river. And we'd hold on to that child before his place is there to show that we care about that child. But then as we're getting ready to leave, we look and see that there are 1, 2, 3, 10, 12, 15, 20 more children floating down the river. What would we do? More police, more firemen, more ambulance would come, and we would pull those children out of the river. But yet we see a constant flow of children in the river. So what would we do? After a while, we'd go upriver, wouldn't we? We'd go upstream, seeing what's causing all these children to go into the river, and we'd do whatever we could to stop the flow of the children into the river so that we could keep those children safe. The first part of the Ammparo strategy addresses the need to pull the children from the water to safety once they are in this country. Most don't realize that once the children come into this country, they're told to turn themselves into the Border Patrol so they can be reunited with a family member living in this country who will serve as their sponsor. Now, you need to know that the government doesn't pay for this transportation to be reunited with their family member. And many don't realize that once they're in the custody of the Border Patrol, they are no longer considered undocumented. They have a legal status according to the United States government, namely an order to appear in immigration court. And when I have been to court and talked to judges, the judges report that nearly all the children appear at court at their assigned times, sometimes over 2 or 3 years. They do not miss a court appointment. Thus, through social service agencies and congregations near the border and the places where the sponsors live, these children are literally pulled out of the water. And so one of the things that this strategy addresses is ensuring that the children are treated humanely and justly once they're in this country, and that when they have their court appearances. Sadly, not every child has legal representation, however, which is something that we're working to remedy. For if a child has a lawyer, it has a much greater chance of being granted asylum as a refugee. So through Ammparo, we are helping children as they are being pulled out of the water. But, as I said, pulling children out of the water is not enough. We're also involved with helping to keep children from going into the river in the first place. We are helping to slow down the number of children coming to this country. This is where the second part of the strategy comes in. We're addressing the root causes of the violence. We are working with companion churches and other organizations. We're helping to provide educational opportunities so the youth can find meaningful work and safety, so they do not feel that need to flee. Our partners are also working with those who have been sent back to the country to help make sure that they do not feel the need to make the dangerous journey again, as well as working to help stop the violence. There's so much more I'd like to be able to tell you, but time doesn't allow for it. You have other plans this day, and so do I. But I would be glad to answer any and all of your questions following the service. It's my hope that you have at least a glimpse of how serious and how dangerous the situation is in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. More importantly, I want you to know, and I hope you know, that the ELCA is indeed helping these children. I would ask for at least for your prayers. So thank you again for inviting me to be with you today, and I invite you to join with us. Continue to look into the blind spot. Help us to pull the children out of the river. Help us to keep them from going into the river in the first place by going to elca.org and then doing a search for Ammparo. There you will find ways that you can become more aware of the situation and what you can do to help advocate for these children. May God bless and protect the children who are fleeing this country, and may God bless your congregation as you seek to serve your neighbor, be they across the street, across the state, or across the seas. Amen.